Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathy Morris. I am the Director of Exhibitions and Collections here at the Clark and the Curator of Decorative Arts. And I want to welcome you to the Clark on this November morning, Armistice Day, Veterans Day, day that we think about all those who lost their lives in the Great War, which ended 100 years ago today, as well as everyone who has served our nation. But today I'm here to introduce our speaker, Michael Hartman. Michael is a PhD student at the University of Delaware, interested in the historical constructs of gender identity, race, and sexuality within the globalized context of 18th and 19th century American art. Michael received his BA in art history and German at the University of Arkansas in 2013, and his MA from the Williams College graduate program in the history of art just in 2018, recent, where his qualifying paper examined the racial confluence between Italians and Native Americans in Albert Bierstadt's figure studies. Michael served as the McDermott curatorial intern at the Dallas Museum of Art in 2013-14, where he curated Katja Kollwitz, a socialist activist in the era of World War I, and assisted on a project curated by Olivier Mellet before Olivier joined us here at the Clark as director. Michael was also the Havner graduate curatorial intern at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in 2017, where he assisted with the projects Art for a New Understanding, Native Voices from 1950s to Now, and Stuart Davis in Full Swing. While at Williams, Michael served as the curatorial intern for prints, drawings, and photographs here at the Clark, where he was what can only be called a star intern. He assisted former Mansion curator Jay Clark with several exhibitions, including Drawn to Greatness, Picasso Encounters, and Japanese Impressions. He gave countless talks, tours, and performed high-level collection research, as well as his work in proposing and then bringing to fruition as curator Extreme Nature, the exhibition that is just open to the public and which is the topic of his talk today. So please join me in welcoming Michael Hartman.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all for being here today. It's very exciting to share what was kind of my final project here at the Clark. And I hope that you will all come away today knowing something new about nature and how we interact with it. A man squints his eyes and peers into a box of honey bunches of oats. Just behind this auditorium, two art historians look inside a FedEx shipping container and converse with one another over its hidden contents. The woman at right now turns, and standing with her back to us, she passes the FedEx box to the former Manton curator of prints, drawings, and photographs, Jay Clark, who many of you might know, as she takes her turn to see what's inside, while another man presses his face against a tall rectangular box aimed towards the heavens. But why? What compelled these art historians to jump up from their desks and sprint out onto the Clark Art Institute's grassy green lawn last August to look inside these boxes? And more importantly for my talk today, what did they have in common with these four people participating in the same event 150 years earlier? Engraved by John Parker Davis in 1865 after a drawing by American artist Winslow Homer. This image portrays Homer's brother Charles and his cousin Florence atop the blustery flat rooftop of Homer's New York studio. One of the unidentified women in the background presses her hands against her billowing skirts on this chilly October afternoon, while the other three people raise thick paper cards pricked with tiny pinholes to their eyes. Aimed at the skies, they look through these assistive looking devices, the precursors to the boxes held by art historians, to watch a solar eclipse, an astronomical event caused when the moon passes between Earth and the sun to block all but the sun's outermost rays. Just as the solar eclipse captivated American audiences last year, so too did nature's awe-inspiring power captivate people in the 19th century. Humanity has long expressed fascination with nature's extremes, whether that be through participating in astronomical events like a solar eclipse, exploring remote and distant landscapes, investigating stormy skies and turbulent seas, or questioning nature's ferocious and destructive power. Travel by newly invented railroads or steamships allowed for greater exploration of the world's unknowns, while the invention of the telegraph seemed to make the world grow ever smaller. News of natural disaster traveled quickly, and reports from the Arctic regions or the American West effortlessly traveled to modern cities and invited readers to imagine their forms. The turn of the 19th century also saw the birth of modern scientific fields. Unlike earlier 18th century scientists who largely classified and cataloged nature's forms, scientists now began questioning the underlying causes of nature's functions. Scientists like Charles Darwin, Marie Curie, Nikola Tesla, Louis Pasteur, and Thomas Edison, among others, published theories explaining the causes of natural phenomena or used their discoveries to harness the Earth's resources. With a rise in literacy, newly founded magazines disseminated scientific information to non-specialist audiences, making these scientists household names among the middle classes. In much the same manner as we flip through the pages of National Geographic to imaginatively travel to distant lands or learn of nature's rarest or more spectacular forms, in the 19th century, scientific journals succeeded by providing an escape from the everyday world, by reporting on nature's wildest and most unfathomable creatures. These new scientific journals challenged readers to contemplate nature's shifting boundaries, but they also inspired artists to consider nature's extremes in their art. The public looked to artists as they sought visual documentation, confirmation, or disavowal of the latest scientific theories and discoveries, while also looking for images of nature's fury unleashed. Looking largely to 19th century artistic representations that incorporate or respond to scientific observation or study, this exhibition explores how depictions of distant landscapes, tumultuous atmospheres, and natural disasters enabled artists and viewers to reimagine the boundaries of the world around them. Reveling in nature's unbridled power, questioning modern scientific theories, or celebrating humanity's ability to overcome environmental extremes, artists mitigated nature's dynamic and often destructive forces by transforming news of the hazardous and unknown circulating in the popular press into awe-inspiring portrayals of natural phenomena. Together, I hope we can explore these relationships between science and art in tandem with the public's desire for nature's extremities in the 19th century. Along the way, I also hope that we might consider connections between how public perception of nature's extremes in the 19th century continues to influence some of our own interactions with science and nature in the present. Perhaps the best method of doing so is by starting with a local landscape that many of us already know. Not far from this auditorium, in 1862, the American artist Aaron Draper Shattuck climbed to the top of Monument Mountain in southern Berkshire County. Standing at the edge of a plummeting cliff and looking out at the breathtaking view extending for miles in all directions, Shattuck pulled out a sheet of paper and, with graphite in hand, sketched the expansive landscape before him. After delineating Monument Mountain's unique geological features, Shattuck used white chalk at the center to sketch out the clouds in the sky and record the sun's beams reflecting off the rocky crag. Looking even closer, though, we discover Shattuck's particular attention to the interplay of light and shadow in the rocks at the lower left. Scribbling beneath them, Shattuck wrote of how the rocks' russet and bright brown, fuzzy lichen growths were surrounded by bright golden green ferns. His notes on color would be useful if he later returned to this drawing as inspiration for a painting. However, his notations also suggest that recording geographic specificity was paramount to Shattuck's sketching practice. Shattuck likely read the writings of John Ruskin, a London-based art critic who encouraged artists to record nature's forms with microscopic accuracy. Even though he was British, Ruskin's theories often appeared in popular American art journals like the Crayon Art magazine, where articles like The Relation Between Geology and Landscape Painting promoted the artistic harmony between science and the arts. Shattuck also subscribed to a popular magazine called Scientific American to stay current with the latest scientific trends, discoveries, and technological innovations to incorporate into his artistic practice. First debuting in August of 1845, Scientific American is still in circulation today, which makes it the oldest continuously published monthly magazine in the United States. The timing of its first publication marked a critical moment in mid-19th century, When new discoveries from all scientific disciplines, such as geology, paleontology, meteorology, as well as others like biology or chemistry, enraptured readers who sought to better understand nature's many forms in an increasingly destabilized and ever-changing modern world. Many American artists subscribed to this magazine, and Shattuck even advertised his own invention, metal stretcher keys used on the backs of canvases, in the magazine's pages. Other artists would need to know of such an invention. Only other artists would need to know of such an invention, which suggests the broad artistic reach of Scientific American. Shattuck's fellow artists not only learned of his invention in the back matter, but some even provided illustrations or numbered among the people who were discussed in its pages. The photographer Timothy O'Sullivan provides one such example. Due to technological limitations of early photography, O'Sullivan's images from the 1871 government-sponsored Wheeler Geological Survey could not be sent directly to the editors of Scientific American. So instead, the magazine published letters from the survey group that detailed their progress in real time as they mapped present-day portions of Arizona and New Mexico. Travel to the American West was hazardous at this point in the century, which O'Sullivan knew firsthand when he embarked on this expedition. Just a few years before taking this photograph, O'Sullivan's boat capsized on the Colorado River, and he nearly died of starvation before reuniting with his group. The absence of flora and fauna in this image suggests the difficulty of finding food and water, and the few lone trees and white tents at the center, dwarfed by towering sandstone cliffs, convey the unimaginable magnitude of this vast western landscape. Subscribers to Scientific American only read about the survey's progress before O'Sullivan's return from the expedition. However, chronicles of the survey's progress created a market for O'Sullivan's images long before his return and their distribution to audiences back east. After his return from the West, O'Sullivan's photographs were widely reproduced in publications, presented in galleries, and even traveled as far as the 1873 Vienna World's Fair. His images of the American West resonated among audiences around the globe due to their crisp replication of uncharted portions of the United States. Prominent photo historian Robin Kelsey has noted how photographs of the American West, quote, translated the West into legible graphic materials that would facilitate resource extraction, military control, and scientific understanding. These coalesce in O'Sullivan's photographs of New Mexico and Arizona, as well as in Edward Muybridge's images of Yosemite. Both photographers promoted the possibilities of expanding scientific knowledge and harnessing natural resources from the vast and seemingly limitless landscape. Muybridge's photographs of Yosemite even spurred the formation of a national park and the beginnings of ecological preservation. Critically, however, his photograph fails to capture the Native American populations who resided in these areas. Through their visual erasure from his landscape, 19th century viewers could easily ignore the violent and militarized removal of Awaniki and Sierra Miwok, Mono, and Paiute peoples from their ancestral lands in Yosemite. While the park was founded in the name of science, the government removal of these native peoples transformed Yosemite into a tourist destination for white Americans, primarily escaping from bustling Californian cities. Photographs of nature's distant landscapes catalyzed the growing pastime of nature-based tourism in the 19th century. Some tourist sites, like Niagara Falls, first gained notoriety long before the invention of photography. Similar to the experience of a tourist in 2018, we might imagine the excitement of a first-time viewer or first-time visitor to the falls in the 19th century. They walked down the covered stairwell to the dock at left and boarded the Maid of the Mist, a boat tour still in operation today. Drenched in mist from their harrowing adventure under the plummeting falls, our imagined spectator stepped off the boat and into a nearby gift shop, where they purchased this small photographic memento of their visit. The allure of remote landscapes inspired artists to incorporate scientific observation into their works as they documented remote locations, replicated its forms in accordance with the latest in modern geology, or even supported a growing tourism industry. During the 19th century, though, many artists also turned their eyes to the skies and examined the impact of weather and other atmospheric phenomena. As we transition from the allure of landscape to images of volatile atmospheres that comprise the second section of the exhibition, we should start by traveling back to the late 18th century, when William Bailey, a relatively unknown officer in the British Army, began collecting prints like Rembrandt's Three Trees, seen here. Storm clouds brew on the horizon above the unaware and smiling picnickers, barely visible at the lower left, who sit alongside the banks of this small waterway. Diagonal lines in the sky above suggest heavy winds capable of blowing rain sideways that roll into the landscape. As a self-taught artist, Bailey copied this print and many other works by 17th century artists, line by line, in order to develop and hone his artistic skill. A comparison of this Rembrandt print to one of Bailey's copies that is also in the Clark's collection illustrates the development of his artistic process. Even though the lines in Bailey's print are harsher and the overall impression is less refined, his work still shows his merit and artistic skill. As his style matured, though, Bailey shied away from producing exact copies and began to offer his own interpretations of Rembrandt's scenes. In this version that is included in the exhibition, crisscrossing forked lightning bolts strike the three trees. The white lightning contrasts with the blackened, swirling clouds, dropping just low enough to graze the landscape's horizon line. Convulsing and folding into one another, they loom ominously over the two figures, seemingly unaware of the immediate danger that they now face. These meteorological elaborations on Rembrandt's original scene reflects newfound European and American scientific interest in weather's causes and effects that arose from the newly founded discipline of meteorology. Prior to 1800, little was known of the workings of our own atmosphere. A pivotal moment occurred in 1752, though, when Benjamin Franklin tied a key to a kite and hoisted it during a thunderstorm, an experiment which proved that lightning was a form of electricity. Not long after, eyes around the world turned upward again in 1783, when the Montgolfier brothers' hot air balloon took flight in France. For the very first time in the history of the world, humans ascended above Earth's surface, and from a small basket suspended in the air, they peered down at the landscape below them. Prominent scientists ascended in the sky and used barometers to study air at varying altitudes above the Earth's surface as they explored the causes of weather's variations. Scientific exploration of the skies in the latter part of the 18th century transpired into a broader desire to predict and perhaps even control weather's forces. Bailey's dramatic atmospheric alterations to Rembrandt's original reflect such a change in scientific perspective. The addition of his lightning bolt proved so widely popular that by 1803, Bailey's version of Rembrandt's Three Trees commanded a higher price than any of Bailey's other prints. The same year also marked the publication of Luke Howard's groundbreaking theory of cloud formation. Howard hypothesized that the formation of clouds arose from a combination of altitude paired with the variables of temperature, wind currents, and air pressure. As a result, Howard, who would later in the 19th century become known as the father of meteorology, categorized clouds as cumulus, stratus, and cirrus, terms still in use today. His work transformed not only the study of clouds, weather, and meteorology, but altered how artists portrayed the skies in their landscapes. One of these included John Constable, whose cloud studies shown here are currently on view in the Manton Gallery for British Art here at the Clark, and if you haven't seen them, I urge you to go have a look after you've seen the exhibition. Another artist equally impacted, though, was Constable's now lesser-known contemporary, John Martin. In Martin's overcast English landscape, light penetrates through the darkened storm clouds at center, and a watery haze extends across the center horizon line to obscure our view of the rolling hills in the background. His watercolor suggests rainfall on a summer afternoon. Martin's interest in clouds and lighting effects reflected contemporary debates on the relationship between clouds and the ordering of the heavens. Like many others influenced by Luke Howard's treatise, the German philosopher Johann Wolfgang von Goethe subscribed to the belief that clouds were linked to spirituality. He privileged almighty cirrus clouds hovering at the top of the atmosphere, believing that they were imbued with divinity due to their proximity to the heavens. Martin's more well-known contemporary, Joseph Mallard William Turner, JMW Turner, also incorporated atmospheric study into his works, although he forewent such stringent religious commentary. In his landscape print of Ben Arthur, Scotland, dark, swirling thunderclouds roll into the valley, which reflect Turner's meteorological curiosities, whereas the shading and shadows on the foregrounded rocks illustrate his geological survey of the landscape. This print also showcases Turner's mastery of various printmaking techniques, combined within a single image. Etching, seen in the hard lines throughout the print, but especially in the foreground, and mezzotint, which records the churning clouds in the skies above one of the most impressive peaks in the Scottish Highlands, combine to render this dramatically charged scene. Turner published this print in his Liber Studiorum, or Book of Studies, a publication that Turner marketed to potential buyers by promoting the exploration of the landscape through artistic innovation. His works called for close attention to nature, both on the Earth's surface as well as in the skies above. The American artist Thomas Moran purchased Turner's Book of Studies and scrutinized Turner's prints to develop his own skills as a printmaker. The churning firmaments, huge boulders, and cracked branches in Moran's bridge at the Pass of Glencoe, Scotland, printed 69 years later, is stylistically indebted to Turner. Moran, though, includes a farmer herding livestock across a narrow bridge at the center of the image, which imbues the scene with a sense of urgency. With no shelter in sight, we are left to ponder the farmer's fate among the oncoming deluge. Perhaps his home lies just beyond the edge of the picture frame, suggesting hope and faith can provide in the face of nature's fury. His farmer beckons us to consider God's divine benevolence, whereas the absence of the human element in Turner's image suggests retribution. The blackened center, with no road leading out of the picture frame, promotes nature's inescapable and totalizing destruction. Turner, Moran, Martin, and Bailey examined and incorporated storms, clouds, and other meteorological phenomena into their works, but many other artists, like Etienne Leopold Trouvelot, chose to look beyond the boundaries of Earth's own atmosphere. First trained as an insect biologist, Trouvelot is best known today for accidentally introducing the gypsy moth to North America in 1865. As many of you might know, this highly invasive species annually defoliates over 1 million acres of forest in New England and the mid-Atlantic regions. Perhaps knowing the gravity of his error, though, Trouvelot abandoned his career as a biologist and began studying astronomy. Roughly 15 years later, Trouvelot released 15 massive color plates to accompany the 1882 publication of his astronomical drawing manual. In this text, he paired scientific explanations alongside massive chromolithographs illustrating planets, a solar eclipse, comets, as well as this mesmerizing print of the 1868 Leonid meteor shower, where faint blue, yellow, and pink meteors tumble from the night sky and reflect in the water at the lower right. Trouvelot portrayed the beauty of the meteor shower through a fine balance of fiction and reality, rendering an astronomical event unable to be captured photographically. Created by an artist-scientist who studied astronomy and dutifully recorded his extraterrestrial observations from Harvard's observatory, Trouvelot's November meteors stood as one of the most scientifically accurate representations of a meteor shower ever produced. Not long before Trouvelot's observations, many scientists believed that meteors shared affinities with lightning and actually originated in Earth's own atmosphere. They suggested that rocks were being picked up on one place and dropped somewhere else. However, the mid-19th century discovery of meteors' extraterrestrial origins garnered international attention from scientists and laypeople alike, which perhaps influenced Trouvelot to include this illustration in his astronomical manual. Like many other artists, Trouvelot advertised his manual in Scientific American, and the copy included in the exhibition, shown here, showcases the growing relevance of astronomical inquiry in the 19th century. The comparative photographs in this particular article juxtapose the moon's topography in the three images on the left with the craters surrounding Mount Vesuvius on the right. By doing so, the author of this article suggests that massive volcanic eruption on the moon's surface formed the moon's craters. While today we know this isn't the case and that the moon's craters are the result of asteroid impacts, these photographs probably convinced many of Scientific American's readers. But if we pause for a moment and consider the history of photography, we soon realize that these images are complete fiction. No one could photograph the moon with such clarity or ascend high enough in a hot air balloon to capture Vesuvius this high in the air. Faced with this technological limitation, scientists falsified these images by fashioning models of Vesuvius and the moon from topographic maps and charts. They then photographed their plaster models and translated them into wood engravings, pictured here, to give the illusion of photographic truth. Photographers and writers of articles such as this one included Richard Proctor, who published in Scientific American as well as in its French and British versions. While esteemed in scientific circles, Proctor believed in the importance of sharing scientific knowledge with the public. His writings for broad audiences achieved such high fame that he collected and published his articles in financially lucrative volumes, such as in this text called Light Science for Leisure Hours. Proctor's studies of the moon, however, proved particularly popular for their musings on scientifically unverifiable phenomena. Using these two illustrations, Proctor speculated what Earth might look like if seen from the moon. He proposed that if we stand on the moon's surface and look out at Earth, it would cycle through phases, much like the moon cyclically transitions in the nighttime sky. In the upper image, Proctor illustrates what he calls a full Earth. He suggests that Earth would transition into smaller crescent shapes as sun and shadow blocked out portions of the Earth's surface and result in the bottom image of New Earth, named after the new moon. His theory was proven correct later in the 20th century. While first and foremost a scientist, Proctor's fame failed to match that of 19th century fiction writers like Jules Verne, whose novels transported readers on fantastical journeys to the center of the Earth, deep into the depths of the seas, or high into the skies above. Just like artists working at the time, Verne drew inspiration from modern science, and his texts imaginatively expanded the boundaries of the known world. Scientific discovery, fiction, and artistic representation coalesce in this illustration from Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. This visual permitted readers to ponder the variety of aquatic life inhabiting the Earth's seas, as if they had submerged with Captain Nemo in his deep-sea submarine and stepped out in these diving suits to study the ocean floor. While his book is entirely fictional, Verne studied the scientific advancement of submarine technology through exhibits on view at the 1867 Universal Paris Exposition and incorporated other modern inventions into his text. Verne's readers, while desiring a fictional journey into nature's unknowns, appreciated the author's attention to the latest in scientific and technological innovation. It was almost as if Verne's novels built upon reality, and indeed, many of his futuristic concepts would become reality in the 20th century. Bridging the gap between real and imaginary, the exhibition's third section considers how artists either incorporated scientific knowledge into imagined images or used mythological or religious subjects to question, to respond to, or disagree with modern-day scientific theories. John Martin, who we remember studied cloud formation and contemplated weather's effect on his painted landscapes, also developed a keen interest in the burgeoning fields of paleontology and geology, which he foregrounded in his Fall of the Rebel Angels. This print illustrates a scene from John Milton's 1667 Paradise Lost, an epic poem based upon Satan's banishment from heaven. Milton vividly described how the angels who rebelled against God were, quote, hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition. And it is this moment that Martin illustrates, as the central angel tumbles into the abyss, aiming his spear at whatever he might encounter deep inside the Earth's cavernous regions. The massive cliffs overwhelm the scene and reduce the falling figures in the background to minuscule white forms. It is as if Earth has opened up its mighty surface to swallow them whole. These cavernous forms reflect Martin's own geological study, and the rock striations and layers foregrounded at the left suggest the passage of millennia. Martin studied the fossil record. He even, did drawings of early dinosaurs and was one of the first artists to do so. But like many of his contemporaries, realized that Earth was far older than the few thousand years suggested by the Bible. His attention to rocks in this image suggests that this is an old Earth, troubling the strict religiosity of the scene depicted and questioning what sorts of bones and fossils might yet lie beneath Earth's surface. Not many years later, Charles Darwin would publish his On the Origin of Species, in which Darwin used animal fossils unearthed in geological digs as evidence for his scientific theories. His writings provided scientists, authors, reporters, and clergymen with ample material for debate and discussion, and even artists like the Swiss painter Arnold Böcklin used his paints and brushes to meditate upon Darwin's theories. Paintings like Böcklin's Triton and Nereid, which hangs at the Neue Pinakothek in Munich, presents what on the surface might be read as a purely mythological scene. In this work, a Nereid, one of the 50 sea nymphs in Greek mythology, lounges naked on a rock in the middle of a vast ocean. To the right, an upright Triton, who was considered a son of Poseidon and a messenger of the sea, turns his back to us and trumpets a conch shell to either call up the waves or soothe the choppy waters. For all of the classical imagination interweaved into the painting's subject matter, no specific mythological tale can be tied to the scene. Böcklin's imagined sea serpent with a yellow patterned underbelly anatomically corresponds to a number of snake species. He presents this undulating sea serpent as the genetic ancestor of modern snakes, creating linkages that extend far into the past to suggest the creature's evolution over time. Finished in 1874, the work became one of the artist's most celebrated paintings, which Wilhelm Heck reproduced as an etching in 1880. A common point raised against Darwin's On the Origin of Species was the lack of intermediate creatures in the fossil record that would prove the biological evolution of animals over time. According to art historian Pamela Court, Böcklin addresses the absence of certain animals from the fossil record in this etching and the subsequent painting. Court suggests that Böcklin's sea monster represents an early evolutionary period, and that Triton's placement at the center as the half-man, half-fish is an imaginary creature that bridges the gap between life's origins in the water and the more human-like Nereid. By invoking mythological forms, Böcklin presents his own artistic vision of Darwin's evolutionary theories. However, Böcklin went even further and also incorporated Darwin's theories of sexual selection outlined in his 1871 publication, The Descent of Man. Examining sexual characteristics of multiple species, Darwin noted that some animals produce musical tones to attract mates. The undulating body of the snake and its erect head grasped by the woman suggests that the music emanating from the Triton's conch shell might actually serve as a mating call, which has summoned this snake from the ocean's depths. The bare-breasted woman with her legs open signals that she too is ready to mate, even though these creatures are biologically incompatible. Reading the work in tandem with Darwin's theories, Böcklin's art is more than an aberration of the classical past, which he selectively evokes in order to directly engage with prevalent scientific theories of his time. Writing a decade earlier, British biologist Thomas Huxley wrote in his Evidence in Man's Place in Nature that, quote, Ovid foreshadowed the discoveries of the geologist, and though the quaint forms of centaurs and satyrs have an existence only in the realms of art, creatures approaching man are now not only known to us, but are notorious. His invocation of mythological creatures prefigured Böcklin's use of Triton to visualize humanity's ancestry. One of Böcklin's admirers, the German artist Max Klinger, also took these words to heart in his Battling Centaurs, who spar over a dead hare in a snowy landscape overshadowed by precipitous mountaintops. Only one centaur will survive this mortal struggle in this barren wasteland, reminiscent of an earlier ice age. Its survival and reproduction, and the reproduction of its offspring across millennia, suggests that the centaur that survives will evolve from this half-horse creature into our own humanoid form. Going beyond Darwin or Böcklin, though, Klinger's scene also suggests the precariousness of our own existence in the face of nature's ruthless forces, by placing this within a barren landscape. He encourages us not only to consider the relationship of his work to leading scientific theories of his day, but to ruminate on our own chances of survival in the face of nature's extremities. Working 18 years earlier, Jules Ferdinand Jacquemart also turned to mythology to examine the perilous relationship between humanity and nature. In the opening plate of his Four Elements, a whirling vortex and deluge of rain spin above a shadowy earth illuminated by fire at the very center, where the inscription Les Quatre Elements, or the Four Elements, rounds the planet's curved surface, just barely visible above the primordial darkness. As described by the ancient Roman poet Ovid, the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, separated from this chaotic mass at the creation of the world to form the foundational building blocks for all living and non-living matter. This view persisted for nearly 2,000 years, until the late 18th century discovery of chemical elements like oxygen. As the chemical elements continued to be discovered throughout the 19th century and became classified according to their properties in the periodic table of elements, Ovid's four elements no longer explained the makeup of matter. However, fire, water, air, and earth provided Jacquemart the opportunity to examine nature's effects in tandem with humanity's futile attempts to control the ephemeral world. By invoking Ovid's description of chaos, this artist reminds his viewers that nature's fury often triumphs human interventions. The Fury of Nature comprises the final section of this exhibition, which focuses on natural disaster, the perils of travel, and the macabre desire for spectacle of nature's destructive forces in the 19th century. The American artist Winslow Homer tackled these in his newsprint illustrations, such as in his Signaling a Passing Steamer on the left, as well as in his works produced directly for the art market, like Saved on the right. In the former, churning waters threatened to envelop the steamer in this newsprint image, endangering the lives of passengers and crew on board. Two seamen at the far left peer over the rail and scrunch their faces in fear as an officer above them sights a passing steamer with his binoculars. Shouting fire to the crew below, flares illuminate the nighttime sky to signal their distress. Their demise is imminent, symbolized by the frail wooden lifeboat hovering on the ship's edge that would surely capsize if deployed among the waves. The drama is overly explicit and readily apparent in this image, whereas in comparison, Saved emotionally abandons the steamship's theatrical spectacle through its more intimate portrayal of a water rescue. The rocks in the background suggest that an unseen ship has failed to navigate the surf. Unlike the newsprint image, the sinking ship exists beyond the edges of the paper, and Homer's focus turns now just to the lone, unknown rescuer who pulls an unconscious woman to safety using a breeches buoy. This life-saving device was rigged by ropes and pulleys to the sinking vessel at one end and either land or another boat at the other. Emphasizing the potential loss of life, the inability to tame nature's fury, and human ability to persevere in adverse conditions, both of Homer's works underscore the sea's destructive power and the hazards of travel in the 19th century. However, Saved, with its critical focus on the two figures in the moment of rescue, perhaps heightens our perceptions and senses, more so than the more illustrative and documentary newsprint. Taken together, though, both highlight the perils of sea travel that papered headlines throughout the century. Water's destructive power was an ever-present force, and no matter the scope of human intervention, its fury could not be thwarted or contained. The most obvious example is perhaps the sinking of the Titanic in the early 20th century, a ship deemed unassailable to nature's forces due to scientific innovation and invention. It plummeted to the ocean's depths on its maiden voyage in 1912, and we still spectacularize this seafaring disaster over 100 years later. Indeed, just earlier this week, an advertisement popped up on my Facebook page inviting me to click on rare Titanic photos which show how horrifying the sinking was. We are still enthralled by this disaster of the sea, which I think stems in part from nature's destruction of a ship supposed to be unsinkable, but also from our grim desire to consume images of disaster. Similarly, in 1885, a disaster-based fireworks show entitled The Last Days of Pompeii opened at New York's Manhattan Beach. In this full-page illustration by Charles Graham, published in Harper's Weekly, fireworks explode while a pyrotechnic recreation of Mount Vesuvius erupts in the background. Actors scramble to safety along the shoreline or furiously paddle boats across the man-made lake in order to escape this reenactment of the historic eruption in year 79 that buried Pompeii under volcanic ash for over 1,000 years. The show played intermittently from 1885 until 1903, capitalizing not only on the constant press attention given to Pompeii's excavations that promoted the site as a tourist destination, but also capitalizing on the growing interest in contemporary volcanic eruptions. Vesuvius erupted 8 times in the 19th century, which spurred increased scientific investigation into the causes of volcanic and seismic activity, and as we might remember, led to the comparison of Mount Vesuvius to the moon in Scientific American. For those without the means to travel abroad and experience the site firsthand, the fireworks show, or even this print, allowed for participation in the spectacle from afar. As several thousand gathered at each show to watch this reenactment of death and destruction, natural disasters became an eerily morbid public pastime. Yesterday marked the 146th anniversary of the Great Fire at Boston, and it seems apt to conclude with this image due to its timeliness and near locality. From a few sparks in the basement of a building in the city's commercial district on the afternoon of November 9th, an inferno ripped through much of Boston, burning throughout the night and into midday on November 10th, 1872. The fire raged for over 15 hours and left more than 1,000 people homeless and another 20,000 without jobs. Like the fireworks show, the Great Boston Fire's destructive beauty, rendered in brightly colored orange and yellow flames below the fiery red smoke illuminating the nighttime sky, entranced us today as much as the real fire captivated spectators who watched the city burn from the safety of their boats floating in Boston Harbor. Most American cities in the 19th century experienced at least one such catastrophic blaze, the most famous being the Great Chicago Fire that occurred just a year before this one. While no photographs of these events are known to exist, the circulation of popular prints, or even plates, such as this one I recently saw on view at the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, transformed these disastrous infernos into morbid and collectible curiosities. Fires were such common occurrences in American cities that one person remarked that, quote, "When the fire breaks out, we'll go out and have a look at it, like deciding to go out to the theater or to a play." Watching fires burn became a voyeuristic experience, similar to how many Americans today consume cable news from the safety of our own homes or spend hours Googling the news on the internet. Like people floating in the water of Boston's harbor or the person who collected this hand-colored print or commemorative plate, we now watch wildfires in real time from cameras perched in helicopters hovering above the blaze. Modern wildfires destroy millions of acres annually, causing far more destruction than the fires that crippled American cities in the 19th century. As we are all aware from the tragic events in recent days, California is in the middle of a 6-year drought, which only fuels the progression of wildfires there. A Scientific American, as we remember, it's still in publication, reported just 3 weeks ago, climate change has, quote, "been found to be exacerbating fires in the western United States through drier vegetation." In the face of this 21st century water crisis that seemingly worsens each year, our response to combating nature's unrelenting forces is no longer as easy as Boston's implementation of standardized fire hydrants, which shortened future emergency response time and lessened the impact of fires. In our current moment, nature's fury looms larger, and such simple solutions like standardizing emergency equipment cannot combat the growing threat of nature's extremes. I hope this exhibition will invite you all to draw connections between past and present and consider the value of science in our everyday lives. As we move into a future where it seems wildfires grow ever more common and hurricanes grow stronger each year, I hope this exhibition might allow all of us to more intimately contemplate our relationship to the natural world and its forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was really a wonderful overview of the exhibition. And I wanted to open up to the audience to see if there are any questions for our speaker.
First of all, thank you very much. And are there any artists today that are drawing these current natural disasters?
There are absolutely contemporary artists today who are responding to natural disaster, to climate change. And I could not specifically name any of them. Perhaps some of the other graduate students here who are more well-versed in contemporary art might have an idea. But I have seen works, but I could not name a specific artist. But great question, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael, for a really great talk. It's making me even more excited to walk through the exhibition after this. I had a question about your tangent about science and its intertwinement with fiction in the 19th century, because I think our contemporary idea of science is pretty hermetically sealed from like its manifestations in popular culture. Like after every big science fiction movie, there's this article. It's like, well, scientists really take issue with pretty much everything about that movie. And I'm wondering if the 19th century has that sort of class of grumbling scientists, or if they are more open to the idea of their science being manipulated by popular culture?
That's a great question, thank you. In the 19th century, we have a lot of scientists who themselves are trying to publish and popularize their theories in ways that are understandable for audiences. This manifests kind of in Scientific American and those sorts of magazines that pop up at the time, because the writers who are authoring those articles are themselves the scientists. And it's a publication that, in addition to covering the latest in science, it also covered like art exhibitions and art openings. So you kind of see this intermingling of art, science, and in some cases fiction, like Jules Verne, that occurs in the 19th century. As far as, artists and scientists not being exactly thrilled with how one another is using it, I haven't actually come across anything like that in my research for this show. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
In terms of the conflict between artists and scientists, recording curious phenomena gives a visual artist or forces him to make decisions about creating an attractive design or reporting things factually. And the example that's now up on the screen, which is a detail of the meteor shower, I've never seen a meteor shower of that intensity, but I don't recall ever seeing a falling star turn around and go back up, nor have I seen one cut suddenly an abrupt angle. So if that is in fact not what happens, somebody is creating what he hopes will be a lively and effective design on the page rather than a clear scientific report. Is that that conflict between art and science, in that sense, something that you've come across often?
Yes. So with this image specifically, it was created by the astronomer who actually went out and viewed the meteor shower. But perhaps knowing that he needed then to sell these works, he elaborated on them a bit from what he saw in reality. I think that what is really particularly interesting about these works in particular is that they haven't ended up in museums. They ended up typically in science departments at universities, or in, and which now have kind of turned into university special library collections, which this image is actually on loan from the Special Collections Library at Williams College. I've found very few of these in a museum collection, and I think it's interesting to think about how, at their time of creation, they were being primarily purchased by libraries and by professors. Yeah.
Michael, I have sort of an answer to one of the earlier questions, and then I have two questions of my own. But a couple of contemporary artists, I was recently doing a little bit of research on this, a couple of contemporary artists that have done a lot of work with kind of plants and nature would be like Sylvia Plemick-Mangold is an example. She does a lot of kind of tree scenes. Wolf Kahn, who's actually like, I think Vermont-based artist, who's also does a lot with nature. Ellsworth Kelly did a number of flower studies that are actually really gorgeous, kind of line drawings. And then there are a number of other artists. Julia Murray, too, for example, works a lot with hurricanes sometimes. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind, but certainly a ever-relevant theme in the art world. So my questions are, first of all, I'm wondering about color, and I know that there were a lot of technical challenges during this time period you're looking at, but I'm just curious, like hand color lithography comes up sometimes, and obviously there are a lot of artists working in watercolor and such. And I'm just wondering what the general consensus was on color and whether it was seen as enhancing realism or kind of not being realistically accurate because of the technological difficulties. So that's the first question. And the second question is coming out of my lit background of this time period. And I'm wondering if you saw in your research any sort of artists that were anthropomorphizing or specifically feminizing the landscape, because I mean, my mind first goes to Joseph Conrad, but just in general, a lot of the colonialist literature of the time period often feminized the landscape, and I'm wondering if you saw that in your research.
Okay. I'm going to answer your color question first while I think about your second question more in depth. I think that for many people, color enhanced the reality of these images. You know, especially when you get through the invention of photography, this image would have looked completely different. For instance, if it was photographed, you wouldn't actually be capturing much. It would be too blurry. And I think that having this image in color would have made it more popular to, let's say, buyers at universities who are looking for these images, but also he did a smaller edition of these that are kind of this size, whereas the one on view is massive, which could have been marketed to more regular people with scientific interest. And they were published, you know, not necessarily by a scientific publisher. They were published by Scribner and Sons. So does that kind of answer your question a little bit? Okay. For feminizing the landscape, I think that in terms of this exhibition, it's not something that I've really thought about. I think it is something that absolutely exists in some senses, especially if we consider how we talk about, we often feminize Earth as a mother. So I do think that relationship probably exists. But in terms of this exhibition, it was not something that I really considered as I was looking.
To answer a question that was posted earlier, last year we were in a course at MCLA where on modern artists, young people today that are drawing the extreme nature of global warming. Mm-hmm. And they were presenting, if I remember correctly, 24 different artists' works on the climate change and how it is affecting the earth with extreme nature paintings. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I don't have their names, but they're young and they're doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I haven't seen the exhibition yet, so maybe you answer my question in the exhibition, but I wanted to ask you, in relation to the question asked by Ralph earlier on about the relationship in the 19th century between art and science. Mm-hmm. You used the term artistic images several times in your talk, and I was wondering if you could just qualify or explain what you mean by artistic images. For instance, how do you distinguish between those and, for instance, Poussin's representation of the deluge?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that in terms of this exhibition, the artistic image is something that actually has the hand of the artist somewhere within the creation of the image. I don't believe I refer to photography as an artistic image at this time. In the terms of its use, in the way that it's used in this show, it's really focusing more on kind of more documenting the landscape. The exception to that, I think, though, is William Bradford's Arctic Iceberg in the exhibition. Bradford went on an exhibition and took photographs of the Arctic, which he said was, quote, solely for the purposes of art, and then returned, created a folio book with those images that I think are more artistically inclined, perhaps, than the other photographs included in the exhibition. And then he also created paintings based on those photographs and made quite a long and lucrative career out of that. Maybe one or two more.
Is the Hudson River School part of that continuum?
Absolutely. They're documenting a landscape that they see as disappearing. So in a way, that's you can kind of read that as early ecological preservation by trying to capture the landscape that is being settled as people move from the East Coast towards the center. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Michael, for giving us an illuminating lecture. And everybody, please now go and enjoy the exhibition.